Okay, when last we met Harrison, which was the first time we met Harrison, we met his foster family. There's a lot of foster kids in there that we don't really necessarily need to know. What we do need to know is that he is being mistreated and not treated well. Everyone says hi, Braden. He is not being treated well by his foster family.
Did you rinse him yesterday?
I did not. I did not read any yesterday. Chapter 3. Mrs. Constable bought cornflakes in plastic bins the size of garbage cans. She had an old coffee cup on a string that she used to serve out a full scoop to each of the kids every morning for breakfast. And despite the fact that the farm produced fresh milk every day, Mrs. Constable filled her kids with powdered milk she got for free from the county. Harrison hated the soapy-tasting pale blue liquid, but he was hungry enough that he'd eat it on his cereal without a word of complaint, and he supposed that the words Mrs. Constable sometimes muttered to herself were true. Don't need to waste good milk on kids like these. After breakfast, Mrs. Constable sent him back to upstairs to wash behind his ears again. When he returned, she took her scissors out of the sewing drawer and told him to sit still on the kitchen stool so she could cut a straight line around his head just below his ears. Harrison did his best not to move, but still, Mrs. Constable managed to nick an ear. She handed him a paper towel to stop the blood, and Harrison tried to whisk the tiny pieces of cut hair free from his neck, where they'd settled into the collar of his only white button-down dress shirt. Mr. Constable appeared in his work clothes, ordered half a dozen fried eggs from his wife, and disappeared up the stairs to change into his brown suit. As Harrison cleaned up the mess from his haircut, he couldn't help sniffing the air as the eggs crackled in their puddles of butter. He knew if he was sly enough, he'd get to lick Mr. Constable's plate before it made its way into the sink for cleaning. Harrison laid his plans as he swept the kitchen floor. By working slow, he was able to delay long enough that he could fill Mr. Constable's coffee cup, then clean out the grinds from the pot, working slowly and offering to clean up the table. Don't you mess that shirt? Mrs. Constable glared over the tops of her glasses, and Harrison wondered just how the thought of a dirty shirt could make someone so angry. I won't. You want me to clean the dishes too, ma'am? The boy doesn't run from work, I'll say that, Mrs. Constable sniffed with pleasure. Even though she had a dishwasher, Mrs. Constable complained about the electricity it used and preferred one of the kids to do it by hand. If he weren't such a godforsaken liar, he'd almost be worth something. Mr. Constable jammed a piece of buttered toast into his mouth and chewed from side to side like one of his own cows. Harrison made his move on the plate, removing it from the checkered tablecloth and hurrying it to the sink, where he got into 2 quick licks before slipping it into the soapy water. Did you just lick that plate? Mrs. Constable's voice cut his ears like a razor. No, ma'am, Harrison lied without pause. You better not. Mrs. Constable removed the plate from the soap and smudged at it with her fingertips. Harrison didn't ask why she cared whether the soapy water got the drips of yolk instead of him. No, ma'am. After the scrape of his chair, Mr. Constable stood and belched and pulled on his suit coat. Time, I'll be back. Time, I'll be back, Mrs. You call him Papa, you hear? Mrs. Constable dropped the plate into the water and scowled. That's how you address Mr. Constable with the judge. You forget that and I'll have a bar of soap to feed you before the afternoon chores. Harrison knew well the taste of laundry soap, and he had to admit that it was a good reminder to call Mr. Constable Papa. Harrison climbed into the bed of his pickup truck with Zip, the jug-headed yellow lab. The truck jounced down the driveway, jarring Harrison's bones until the tires hummed on the smooth blacktop. The wind whisked through his shortened hair, and Harrison flicked at the tiny brown pieces still clinging to his neck. Town held the county courthouse and several brick government buildings, as well as the crumbling storefronts of the past 150 years. Once busy with trade from the railroad, they now sold nothing much more than yarn and used furniture. There was also 2 bars, a diner, and a nail salon, while the rest of the windows held for sale signs behind their dusty glass. The courthouse was a busy place, though. Just outside town, a large modern prison housed the state's less dangerous criminals and offered up most of the good jobs for 50 miles around. Half the people in the courthouse seemed to be prisoners, and none of them was ever as glum as Harrison would be if he had to wear handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit. Mr. Constable's shoes clapped against the wood floor as they passed through a metal detector, and Harrison followed him to the back part of the courthouse, the new part with the low ceilings, fake blonde wall, and fluorescent tubes of light. In a courtroom that looked more like a classroom to Harrison, the judge sat on a low platform behind his bench. A state flag drooped alongside the American flag, and a brass clock hung on the wall. Mr. Constable waved to the lawyer, and they sat down. Harrison scanned the room for his mother, but she wasn't there anywhere to be seen. The judge scolded 2 teenage boys in orange jumpsuits before banging his gavel on the desk and watching them be ushered out by an armed guard. The boys looked scared, and the judge seemed satisfied with that. Harrison tugged at the collar of his shirt, replaying all the things he'd done recently that might put him in the company of the imprisoned boys. Harrison Johnson. The bailiff looked out over the courtroom, and Mr. Constable leaned close. Don't forget, Papa. Mr. Constable stood. Harrison did too, and followed his foster father to the front along with the lawyer, a greasy-looking man in a green suit with food stains on its sleeves. Melinda Johnson? The bailiff craned his neck, and Harrison turned his head, also scanning the room. Miss Johnson? Melinda Johnson? Mr. Constable spoke to the lawyer under his breath. All this fuss and she's too drunk to show up? The lawyer nodded as if it was just another expected part of his job. Harrison's heart sank. Is Melinda Johnson here or counsel for Mr. Johnson? The judge looked up over the top of his glasses and glared out across the room, clenching his teeth until the cords pulsed in his neck. I see. Mr. Constable, will you approach the bench with your ward and counsel, please? The judge looked at Harrison with distaste before turning his attention to the lawyer. Mr. Denny, do you have the paperwork for this boy's adoption? The lawyer fumbled with his briefcase, nodding and winking until he came up with a thick packet of papers. Right here, Your Honor. Then, the judge said, examining the papers, given the trouble Miss Johnson has caused in all of this and her apparent lack of responsibility, as well as respect for this court, I might add, all leads me to believe that this best course of action for this young boy is to make him the legal and permanent son of Mr. and Mrs. Brad Constable. A look passed between Mr. Constable and the lawyer that Harrison didn't like. It was the look of 2 bank robbers who'd been invited into the vault. Harrison scanned the courtroom behind him again, feeling desperate and sensing that something very big was about to happen, something that would change the course of his life, something that couldn't be put right again, something very bad. What is that? Foreshadowing, absolutely. So why did Mr. Constable want Harrison to call him Papa?
Because he wanted to be his daddy. So it looked like he actually liked him.
So it looked like Mr. Constable actually liked Harrison. Is that good? It's bad. It's not a nice way, like putting on appearances for the court when you treat them like that at home. I mean, feeding the children that are in your care, you know, soggy cereal and powdered milk when you are making your husband 6 eggs for breakfast with real milk. I mean, it's one thing if you're trying to save money and you know, everybody has the not great stuff. That's one thing, right? But
How many kids they actually have?
they have, I think, like 7 kids in their care at this point.